Everybody, welcome back from break. I hope you guys had an excellent break and are surviving this nasty April shower that we get April 1st. A few things before we get started. Just a reminder, this Wednesday in class, your second project is due. That's the looking assignment that you guys got in section. It's also posted online. So do check that out. Again, you have a whole bunch of options. Second thing I wanted to announce is that sections this week are going to be meeting up at the Bade Museum. You guys probably already had this on your calendar, but Tony's going to be taking you guys up to the Bade Museum at the graduate.
I will meet you there, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I will meet you at the front of the museum. And the directions are under announcement. I will trip to the museums. We have all the directions there. How to get to the museum.
Fantastic. Great. Yeah. So meet Tony up there. I'm sorry. Meet Tony at the museum. And again, that's just right out North Gate, up to the left. You guys can find it. It's fairly easy to find. Any announcements? Anything? Orders of business? Now that we're kind of coming back into the swing of things, a rude awakening as we wrap up the semester. All right. Well, why don't we pick up where we left off a week ago? And we're continuing on this week with the Late Bronze Age. We're going to be looking today at a specific city-state that is very important for understanding the Late Bronze Age. This is the city-state of Ugarit. Ugarit's important for a number of reasons. Last time we talked about the Levant, modern Israel, Jordan, and parts of Syria, as being this real international crossroads during the Late Bronze Age, right? We've got the Hittites to the north, which we looked at in depth, Egypt to the south, the rise of Assyria, the fall of Mitanni, Babylon, the Elamites, and then far off to the west, Ahiawa, the emergence of these Greek city-states such as Pylos, Mycenae. This is the time period that Homer was writing about when he was talking about the Trojan War. So as you can see, smack in the middle of this is the Levant, and it really is a cultural crossroads. And of all the cities that exemplify this internationalism, this hybridization, the city of Ugarit is pretty much a microcosm for understanding this process. The kingdom is a fairly large one. It's about 2,200 square kilometers, with the northern border of Mount Safon, and to the east and the south, it's defended by the Alawi Mountains. And it's composed of three major sites. The tell at the city of Ugarit is known as Ras Shamra. You can see it here. I've listed them on the board. With a port right along the coast that's named Minyat el Bidia. And there's another site about 5 kilometers to the south named Ras Ibn Hani, which we'll come to a little bit later. But these three major sites compose what really is a coastal site that's, again, situated to take advantage of not just trade in the Mediterranean, right, all along the southern coast of Hatti, from Egypt, Cyprus, right, but also poised to take advantage of east-west trade routes by land. So when it comes to trading with Babylon, with Assyria, Ugarit's perfectly positioned to take advantage of everything there. The site was actually founded in the Neolithic period, but really it's during the LB2A, or I'm sorry, it's during the LB2B that it really flourishes. So again, that's that period, the second half of the Late Bronze Age, 1400 to 1200 BCE. And what we see is 8 kings. It's a dynastic series of kings ruling the city, 8 kings over the course of 2 centuries. And we actually have records of this through the cylinder seals that they used. There was a dynastic cylinder seal they would pass down from king to king and so on. We know that in the first half of the Late Bronze Age, Ugarit was a vassal kingdom to Egypt. We actually have records from Amenhotep III that indicate that the city was under his control during the Amarna correspondence, for example. Right? And then we saw how that shift during the reign of Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, right? Everything falls apart, Egypt recedes, and the Hittites really take control. So at that point, Ugarit switches sides over to Hadi. It's destroyed in about 1316, perhaps by an earthquake or a tidal wave. Actually, there's a lot of research out there that says Ugarit might have been destroyed by a tsunami during this time. But we know it's rebuilt in 1350, and at that stage we really see it shifting its allegiances. We talked about this guy, Aziru of Amuru, last time, this character in the Amarna correspondence who is this kind of shady character who turns against the Egyptians to the south and sides with the Hittites. Ugarit actually falls under his control during this time. Shortly thereafter, it becomes a Hittite vassal. It's subject to a treaty by Shuppi-Luilumas, who we encountered last time. The Hittites at the city controlled trade, they controlled disputes, but still Ugarit was tied to Egypt in terms of its trade relationships, and especially after that treaty that's signed between the Egyptians and the Hittites, Ugarit really flourishes. It continues to flourish during this period. The kingdom, because of its location, is incredibly prosperous in terms of its economics, but militarily very weak. We have records from Ugarit that every sort of vassal is supposed to send troops to aid the kingdom of that it's associated with. So the Hittites end up sending the Ugaritic king letters saying, "Send us troops," and instead the king at the time, Ibiranu, writes back saying, "Well, we're not going to send you troops, but we're going to send you grain." Trying to basically pay off this tribute that Ugarit owed to the Hittite capital at Hattusas with goods instead of services. So Ugarit is doing this very delicate balancing act throughout the Late Bronze Age. At first siding with Egypt, later siding with the Hittites in the north, and maintaining throughout that period a real sense of its own identity. It's a very unique site, as we'll see, but also its own independence economically. This site is wealthy not just because of its location, but also its access to resources. Ugarit made its wealth off of two major commodities, if you will. One was copper, coming from Cyprus, right here. You can see again these oxhide ingots, which we've encountered before. We'll talk about those a little bit later. And also timber coming from the hinterland, right in Lebanon and Syria, which could have been shipped down for use in the temples by the Assyrians, by the Kassites, by the Egyptians. So they're doing a brisk trade in local resources. At the same time, we see a lot of local crafts and industries at Ugarit that are quite interesting. Here's a view of Ras Shamra from the sky. You can see Ras Shamra is here. Ras Ibn Hani is way down here. And then Minyat El Badia, the port, is actually around here. Purple dye is one of the local products that is produced at Ugarit and actually all down the Canaanite coast during the Late Bronze Age. This dye comes from a really interesting snail, which is called the murex. Murex shells were harvested in the Late Bronze Age into the Iron Age. Actually, it goes all the way into Rome. Those of you who are familiar with Roman purple, the robes that the emperor would wear, that were reserved for these leaders. This is where it comes from. It's actually a snail, and it's a secretion that comes out of this snail. And as you can see here, there's a modern photo of somebody dyeing these strands of cloth with murex, which gives it this very vivid, beautiful purple dye. A lot of what we know about the items that were traded and the way that they were traded come from a number of different archives that come from Ugarit. I should mention too that Ugaritic as a language, it's a Semitic language, it's a West Semitic language, but the way that it's written in cuneiform, but it's cuneiform that is modified. It's cuneiform that's used alphabetically. So you actually have signs that represent a phonetic complement in the writing, which makes it actually much easier to learn and actually much easier to crack. Ugaritic was cracked actually in a matter of months after this site was discovered in 1929 by Claude Schaefer. And actually it's very important actually the shift to alphabetic use, because that later on goes into the alphabetic, the use of alphabetic languages by the later Phoenicians, as we'll see in the Iron Age, and actually up to today. These texts give us a tremendous amount of detail about the type of trade that's going on and the items that are traded, not just local murex, but records of wool, copper, grain, staple goods, but also we get this the evidence of really what's taking place, a luxury trade good, or luxury trade goods. I'll give you an example. Wine is incredibly important in these lists. We've talked about beer before, but let's talk a little bit about wine, especially in the late Bronze Age. We have thousands of these tablets that record financial transactions, treaties, diplomatic and economic correspondence. Among these records of wine transactions, we can actually look at the price of wine, what it's traded for, and get a sense of its value. For example, we see different types of wine being traded. There's wine known as a yen teb, which is a good wine, or a yen dl teb, a wine which is not good. So different varieties. Sale lists. We have one receipt from Ugarit for the sale of 52 jars of wine, and the price for those 52 jars were 14 5/6 shekels. We talked about shekels before, of silver. So roughly that comes to 0.3 silver Ugaritic shekels per jar of wine. And according to the exchange rate at the time, just to give you a sense of what that means, you could get pretty much half a sheep for that. That's the value. So one of these things of wine would have been the equivalent of a half of a sheep. Another tablet, however, records the distribution of 12 jars of wine of a very special and particular variety, wine which was known as Kepselem. And this was purchased for 440 silver shekels, which comes out to about 36 2/3 shekel per piece. And considering that one can buy 3 bowls or a small house for the same price, this particular wine is clearly a luxury import. This is your very fine Dom Perignon being traded around the Mediterranean at this time. So it's very interesting, the degree of detail that we can get out of these texts. While we don't have really great attestations of the use of wine at Ugarit itself, we know that wine was traded extensively in Egypt. So I have these images up here. It was consumed during the late Bronze Age by the elite kings we've talked about, Amenhotep III at his palace in Malkata, Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten at Tel el Amarna, and actually later even with Tutankhamun, right, the end of the 18th dynasty. And I just wanted to throw these up here because it's really interesting because these wine jars actually contain hieratic inscriptions on their side. Some of them actually say that they came from Syria. So Egyptians are importing Syrian wine from places like Ugarit during this time. And these labels record the vintage year, they record the quality, they record the name of the chief winemaker, which was apparently a position of some status, and most of these chief winemakers were Syrian, actually. So there's this real push in the New Kingdom in Egypt to get Syrian wine, to get Syrians to come and grow your vineyards for you. And the stoppers on the top have stamp seals on them that actually say where the grapes were grown, which vineyard they're from. So it's a form of appellation contrôlée, or really connoisseurship, very similar to the kinds of way that we consume wine today. In fact, when you think about it, right, year, quality, the name of the vinter, there's actually